Trust, John Farrell, CEO, Farley, CEO, and Dr. Susan Flaherty, Mental Health Commission, and Jerry Carroll, Chair, and Fiona Murphy, the Irish Criminal Civil Justice Disability Network. So you're very welcome to the meeting. And I must remind members that they are only allowed to participate in the meeting if they're physically present within the complex of Leinster House. And in that regard, members are joining this meeting remotely. I would ask you to confirm that you are on the grounds of Leinster House prior to your contribution. For anyone watching this meeting online, witnesses are accessing the meeting remotely due to the unprecedented circumstances. I would ask everybody bear with us should any technical issues arise. Before we commence the formal proceedings, I must first bring some formalities. So on privilege, you are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of the proceedings are to be given, and you respect the parliamentary practice to the effect where possible you should not criticise or make charges against a person or persons or entity by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I wish to advise witnesses giving evidence from a location that doesn't apply. I think all witnesses are in-house today. So now members, of course, are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment or criticise or make charges against the persons outside of the House or an official, either by name or such, to make him or her identifiable. So now I will go to Fiona Murphy, the Irish Criminal Civil Justice Disability Network, to make her opening remarks. So Fiona.
Thank you for the invitation to address the committee today. In writing this statement, I was very much reminded of a young boy I was humbled to know, Kevin Dunford from Ballina, County Mayo. A bright young boy with the life-limiting condition, Kevin was non-verbal. Despite these challenges, Kevin had the innate ability to communicate honestly and assertively, using all of his other senses, his beautiful eyes, hand movements and gestures. Inspired by Kevin and his ability rather than his disability, we began to study international evidence relating to the prevalence of persons with disability engaging with the criminal justice process and their overrepresentation within the prison population. We wanted to explore how we could ensure every measure possible is taken to support persons with disability who engage with the process. Concerned by the possible consequences for those with a disability, in particular individuals with hidden disability, it was important to not only understand their lived experience, but also the experiences and challenges of those working in the system and their awareness of disability and neurodiverse conditions, mental health, addiction and early childhood trauma. In light of the UN CRPD and other domestic legislation, the need to establish a practical working dialogue and understanding in relation to access to justice, human rights, structural violence and abuse was ever more critical. With the support and encouragement of the ACJRD and other stakeholders, the initiative was developed through examining research, the gathering of anecdotal evidence and capacity building. The ICJDN was developed and has contributed to various events and discussions over the last number of years. Importantly, in 2016, seminars entitled Towards Compliance with the UN CRPD, the Role of Criminal Justice Professionals, was held in Limerick and Dublin. To bring together participants from the areas of disability, health and criminal justice, a roundtable discussion organised by the ICJDN was held to facilitate the sharing, learning and exploration of opportunities that would improve access to justice in a way that would be cost-effective, collaborative and mutually beneficial. What clearly emerged from the report was the willingness and active desire from both criminal justice agencies and the disability community to work proactively together to meet a shared challenge in a very human way. While in the process of designing online training materials, the ICJDN, with thanks to Brady Fitzgerald, Cassia Zabinska and Board Director Eamon Ryan, an important communications technique was developed. The PARC technique was showcased in 2019 at a Neurodiversity in Criminal Justice conference. Feedback was incredibly positive, with eminent Professor Dame Sue Bailey, a consultant child and adolescent forensic psychiatrist and Professor of Child and Adolescent Mental Health, remarking that the material should be on every public health screen across the country, thus illustrating its flexibility across other settings such as healthcare and education. Our training also includes a powerful video shared by Prosper Fingal Produced by and featuring individuals with a disability, it aptly places the audience into a position where they are left examining their own attitudes and unconscious bias. In designing materials, we were keenly aware that whenever an individual engages with the public service body, there is an automatic power imbalance. And more important, and more often than not, those who are engaging with these services are in a vulnerable position. Rather than focusing on individual disabilities, we sought to concentrate on how persons may present, the challenges and obstacles they face, while also providing training on how to tune in and manage encounters compassionately and safely through effective communications, de-escalating techniques, tools for early identification, and when to seek support and intervention. In 2019, we delivered a pilot training programme to the Gardaí. The model of our training delivery is multidisciplinary and depends very much on the participation of healthcare professionals and advocates with lived experience of disability. This was followed by further approaches and discussions with 3 other criminal justice agencies. Proposals were sought, submitted and positively received. The structure of the ICJDN was informed by findings in the UK from the Bradley report, where Lord Bradley identified that one of the main problems with previous policy development has been the piecemeal approach taken, noting one of the most common phrases repeated to him by stakeholders time and again was that people and organisations are working in silos. The ICJDN continues to take an inclusive and holistic social model approach to addressing effective access to justice for persons with a disability. All the valuable work to date has been done pro bono, and this is not sustainable. Despite continuing engagement, we are concerned that the proposed actions from the roundtable discussion and evidence-based research have yet to be implemented. Due to COVID-19 and its disruption across public bodies, we are still awaiting responses to each of our proposals. In the meantime, we need to highlight the necessity for adequate funding and a more formalised structure to progress the work of this initiative. We strongly feel our approach will affect change and positively impact on the criminal justice process for those with a disability, rather than serving as a mere box-ticking exercise. We believe an investment of resources is likely to provide a net benefit to the state in terms of delivering improved outcomes for people with a disability who deserve support and specialist care provision. However, this can only be done through the appropriate delivery of valuable supports and resources that honestly address the challenges faced by those working in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that. John Farrell, you might give us your opening remarks, please, John.
On behalf of the Mental Health Commission, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Susan Finnerty, who's the Independent Inspector of Mental Health Services. The Commission is an independent statutory body established under the provisions of the Mental Health Act. Our principal functions are to promote, encourage and foster the establishment and maintenance of high standards and good practices in delivery of mental health services, and take all reasonable steps to protect the interests of persons detained in approved centres. The remit of the Commission has also been extended by the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, which is going through the Oireachtas now, the amendments which will provide for the establishment of the Decision Support Service for adults with capacity difficulties. People with a mental illness should receive compassionate care and treatment in a modern health system. They should not be incarcerated in prisons or criminalised. Although there have been improvements in the attitude towards and treatment of people with mental illness in the justice system, there still remain significant barriers. Dr. Finnerty has recently published her report on access to mental health services for people in the criminal justice system, which raises a number of specific concerns. People with a mental illness and who have been accused or convicted of a criminal offence have unequal access to mental health services compared to those who have not offended. Ireland is far behind comparable countries in providing a comprehensive forensic mental health service when a person with a mental illness encounters the criminal justice system. Also, there are many gaps in our general Irish mental health services which lead to mentally ill people ending up in the criminal justice system. We still have people who are severely ill locked in isolation units, and we saw this, myself and the inspector, with our own eyes, and other areas of Irish prisons awaiting mental health care in appropriate settings. This fundamentally breaches their human rights, and Ireland has been rightly criticised by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment for this. In some prisons, the in-reach teams are substantially under-resourced and struggle to provide a comprehensive service. The inpatient forensic mental health service in the Central Mental Hospital provides care and treatment based on international best practice, but the waiting list for a place in the CMH continues to grow as more mentally ill people enter the prison and justice system. After decades of reports stating that the CMH was not fit for purpose, we now have a state-of-the-art building in Portrane, which should be opening soon, and this will increase the beds from 102 to 170, including a unit for children and an intensive care regional unit. This will bring our forensic beds from 2 per 100,000 to 3.5 per 100,000. However, this is still substantially lower than many other European countries. In regards to the south of the country, there's very poor resourcing of the forensic mental health teams in Cork and Limerick. It's quite astounding, and still there is no coherent plan for the development of these services. There are no intensive care regional units in the south and west, as set out in the government policy of a hub and spoke model of forensic mental health services. Our interviews and the inspectors' interviews with service users, prisoners and carers were enlightening and demonstrated that there are multiple points in the pathway for care of people with mental illness who enter the criminal justice system that require resourcing and changes. This is especially urgent in the diversion of mentally ill people away from the criminal justice system into mental health services where their health needs can be met. We just briefly want to touch on An Garda Síochána too. In 2009, the Commission and An Garda Síochána issued the report of the Joint Working Group on Mental Health Services and the Police. That report made a number of recommendations, including the creation of a 24/7 statutory social work service, expanded training for Gardaí, and the implementation of adequate court diversion programmes to deal with minor criminal matters involving individuals with mental health problems. And 12 years later, and very few of these recommendations have come to fruition. One issue which we've focused on over the last few years is the increased use of Section 12 of the 2001 Mental Health Act, which gives a member of An Garda Síochána the power to take a person into custody if they believe that a person is suffering from a mental disorder, and that because of that mental disorder there is a likelihood of the person causing immediate and serious harm to himself or other persons. Section 12 was actually enacted with the expectation that it would be used in exceptional circumstances. There has been a worrying increase in the volume of applications made. There were 1,971 admission orders for involuntary detention for the community in 2021, and 35% of these were initiated by members of An Garda, compared to 32% in 2020. Given the increase in applications made by An Garda, the MHC contacted the Garda Commissioner and the Policing Authority and met with them in July 2021 and a number of meetings throughout the year to discuss its concerns. I want to acknowledge that An Garda have engaged in a meaningful way with the MHC over the last number of years and actually share a number of the MHC's concerns, not least the human rights aspect of Section 12. The statistics provided to the MHC by An Garda in relation to use of Section 12 applications are worryingly high. And may indicate, so for example in 2018, 4,000 people were taken into custody using this section of the Act. So worryingly high, and may indicate a systemic issue where thousands of people are being detained by An Garda, ostensibly with little independent oversight or scrutiny. As it stands, An Garda Síochána still remains the only agency immediately available day or night to respond to crises in the community, and the limited training and support available to them creates a situation where the most vulnerable in our society are potentially being failed. People with a mental illness should receive compassionate care and treatment in a modern health system, as opposed to being forced into a criminal justice system which cannot meet their needs or vindicate their human rights.
Thank you very much. Saoirse, Brady.
Thanks to the committee for the invitation and the opportunity to present to you today on this really important topic of accessing justice. The Irish Penal Reform Trust is Ireland's leading NGO campaigning for rights in the penal system and the progressive reform of Irish penal policy. Our core message is that a penal system that protects and promotes human rights, equality and social justice and relies upon prison only as a measure of last resort will contribute to safer communities for everyone. People with disabilities are a significant but overlooked population in the Irish penal system, and IPRT accordingly welcomes the opportunity to highlight the challenges that these individuals face and identify the ways in which the state can better vindicate their rights in accordance with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The topic under discussion today is obviously very wide-ranging, but we will focus on 3 key issues. Firstly, the lack of data on disability within the penal system. Secondly, the treatment of people with disabilities in the penal system. And thirdly, the importance of diversion from the criminal justice system. So I will be echoing some of what my colleagues have already said. IPRT's research has identified significant gaps in data on the prevalence of disability in Irish prisons. Reasons for this may include some disabilities going unrecognised within the penal system and/or issues arising in respect of the screening tools used in prison. The limited data that is available in Ireland primarily relates to psychosocial or mental health disabilities and intellectual disabilities within the prison system. Mental health among the prison population is a serious concern, with some studies estimating that the prevalence of severe mental illness among the prison population is 4 times that of the general population. It is estimated that nearly 1 in 3 prisoners in Ireland have an intellectual disability, although data is incomplete. The Inspector of Mental Health Services has noted that people with intellectual disability are overrepresented in all parts of the criminal justice system, including police custody. The absence of robust and current data on the extent of disability of all forms within the prison population and those interacting with the criminal justice system makes it difficult to address the rights and needs of these individuals. Therefore, we would recommend that systems for collection of data on disability should be devised and implemented across the criminal justice system to identify and address the barriers faced by people with disabilities in accessing their rights. Prisoners with disabilities face many challenges in navigating the prison environment. For example, IPRT's 2020 research report, Making Rights Real for People with Disabilities in Prison, identified significant concerns about the environmental accessibility of Irish prisons for people with disabilities, with some individuals being unable to leave their cells or wings for large portions of their prison stay and accordingly have limited access to education, employment and recreational activities. There were also difficulties for prisoners with disabilities in accessing healthcare services such as physiotherapy and speech therapy, as well as mental health supports that go beyond psychiatry. The report found that inaccessible information and a lack of information on the prison and its rules in turn can cause difficulties for people with disabilities in following the disciplinary system. There was a lack of awareness among prisoners with disabilities on their right to reasonable accommodation, with some describing being denied access to devices that they relied upon outside of prison. And there were concerns around people with mental health illness being held in isolation and/or safety observation cells, which in some circumstances amounted to solitary confinement, or in other words, confinement and isolation for more than 22 hours a day. Finally, bullying of prisoners with disabilities has been identified as a matter of concern in both IPRT's report and a recent report from the Inspector of Mental Health Services. This can sometimes result in people trying to hide their disability while in prison. Therefore, we would recommend that the Irish Prison Service should undertake accessibility audits of all prison settings and engage in a disability equality analysis of its service and ensure that all those working in prison receive training on responding to the needs of prisoners with disabilities. We would also recommend that all prisoners experiencing mental health difficulties should be offered appropriate non-psychiatric responses, including access to psychology, counselling and survivor-led peer support. The placement of people with disabilities in solitary confinement should be prohibited in line with international human rights standards. IPRT wishes to take the opportunity to re-emphasise that people with severe psychosocial disability should not be in prison and should, wherever possible, be diverted from the criminal justice system and provided with access to appropriate treatment in the community or an alternative therapeutic environment. The focus of the recently established high-level task force on diversion is welcome, and IPRT eagerly awaits publication of its final report and implementation plan. Regarding the potential human rights issues in diverting prisoners into secure psychiatric settings, IPRT is clear that there must be robust consent processes and procedural safeguards in place whenever a transfer is to take place. IPRT is soon to publish research on the rights of people detained in secure forensic settings in Ireland, which will further inform and develop this position. We would call for the high-level task force final report and high-level implementation plan to be published without further delay. Thank you again for the invitation to attend today's session. Myself and my colleague Sarahjane McCreery would be happy to further discuss any aspects of our statement or answer any questions that the committee might have on any of the issues raised or anything else that we can help with. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, we'll go to our members. So the first is Mary Siri Carney. So Mary.
And thank you all very much for your very powerful opening statements. I was called to the bar and I did my first year in delving in criminal law, and it involved a lot of prison visits. It has haunted me since, that experience of closed doors, absolute control over your life. That when you go through, and so I always came from my very first visit to others subsequently during that year to come away with that sense of helplessness, that for someone entering into the prison system for the first time, how frightening that must be. I think that if you have a mental health illness or issues, or you have intellectual disabilities, or any disability, how much more helpless must that be? And so very much, particularly Saoirse, in your opening statement, I think that very much comes across. I suppose establishing the data is really important. Establishing rights. How are rights vindicated in the prison system for people with disabilities? I went on to be an employment lawyer, so I'm used to disability and, both under the Equal Status Act, under the Employment Equality Act, and the vindication of rights for people with disabilities in that context. But in the prison system, how is that? And I think that the threat and the experience of bullying must be all the more if you are obliged to hide a disability. So I would appreciate any advice back to us on how we might do that. Also, I suppose it's very powerful, the sheer numbers that the Section 12 is being used against is really quite frightening. And I suppose it strikes me, while I understand its necessity in law and that there is a necessity to have that power in certain very exceptional circumstances, but it strikes me that what training and competencies do, while I have enormous respect and regard for our Garda Síochána, but in the heat of a moment, what checking or oversight is there for their discretionary use of what is their view and we have checks and mechanisms in other areas of criminal law that safeguard against the exercise of Garda discretion in situations like that. But what systems are there and what recourse to appeal is there? And so I think it would be important to hear that. And I suppose coming back, Fiona, I mean, it horrifies me every time there's a major report in the country and there's a rush to judgment of mental health issues, of whatever, if there's a major incident or a very significant incident. And to me, it always belies an unconscious bias at a national level to an instant rush to judgment and a presumption that once you have a mental health issue at all, that there is somehow you are out of control, you cannot be, you must be curtailed, you must be corralled. There's a whole appalling discriminatory attitude that follows that. So, and I think that your contribution this morning has articulated that very well in the programme that you run to expose that unconscious bias. So I suppose the vulnerability of suspects, what can we do to support them, to ensure that they have representation beside them, perhaps, to ensure that they're not left vulnerable. And I suppose if we have, well, perhaps I'm best left there, but it concerns me about the erosion of the presumption of innocence once you have any sort of a mental health issue manifests, and whether it manifests, it has always been there beforehand and diagnosed and gone untreated, or whether it's exacerbated by being in a situation where you were a suspect or in a situation of the prison system. So what more can we do? How can we do that? Would be my question.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So will we start with Saoirse and then Fiona and then maybe to John or to the mental health? So Saoirse.
Yeah, so I might start and go to my colleague Sarahjane. So Senator, thanks very much for your comments. And how are rights vindicated in the prison system? Well, first of all, you have to know what rights you have before you can vindicate them. So the information that is provided to people is extremely important. And IPRT has done a Know Your Rights accessible guide in plain English based on the prison rules on what your rights are. But certainly in the research that I referred to, what we found was that, you know, if somebody is deaf in the prison system, there are very limited interpretation facilities. So, you know, again, that comes down to resources. There is an ongoing review of the prison rules at the moment, so we would hope that that would take into account some of these issues around disability. But I think that we need to look at other kind of more innovative ways as well to communicate with people and ensure that they know their rights from the outset in order for them to even be able to vindicate them at all. Sarahjane, did you want to add anything to that? Sorry.
So just to add to what Saoirse said, prisoners in the report Making Rights Real, they actually spoke of a lack of information in the form of braille, audio, visual information, easy to read languages, and that's not just the prison rules, that's actually all types of information pertaining to what goes on in prisons, the regimes and how to navigate the prison. So that was extremely inaccessible for the people, the 16 prisoners in the report. But I suppose in terms of vindicating rights, something that always gets flagged by IPRT, and it's really important to flag now, is an effective complaints mechanism in prisons. So in our report also, the people in prison with disabilities, they noted that they were afraid basically to make a complaint to the complaint system in case they received kind of ill treatment by prison officers who they were complaining against. A lot of the time that was related to disability discrimination, which is really, really problematic. So we've been calling it for a very long time, but 100% an effective complaints mechanism needs to be in place in prisons, and it's currently not. It's under review for a long time now, and it's been promised, but we need it effective immediately, not just for people with disabilities, but for everybody.
Perhaps we could take your guidance, and this committee can write in, in support of your position there, from our place and our voice.
Okay, do you want to comment, Fiona?
Yeah, I suppose we take a slightly different perspective that complements what's been said already, in that we need to look at the first interactions between a person and the criminal justice system, and how, if they're not managed appropriately, somebody could end up in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it really needs to start, on the street with first encounters. And I'm reminded here, actually, I have a piece where there was a young man with autism who an allegation was made that he was hitting two girls with sticks. And he was arrested, and he wasn't treated very well in custody, and he was awarded costs against the state, but his counsel said that there was there was an issue about whether the man was lawfully detained under the Mental Health Act 2001. The man himself couldn't communicate verbally, and his mother was also dead, so neither could give evidence. So that just shows you how quickly the unconscious bias stepped in, I suppose, and by all accounts, previous complaints have been made to the guards about suspicious activity around the area, and I think they jumped to a conclusion in relation to this individual. So I think that training, you go back to training. I think the guards are under-resourced anyway. I do think, and our interactions with them anyway, individually, they're quite passionate about addressing this issue as well. Yeah.
Good,
Great,
thanks,
thank you.
Fiona, thank you. John, Susan?
In relation to the Gardaí?
Yes.
So the figures that we've given you there, how it came to our attention was during COVID. The figures went up at the start of COVID, and people were particularly vulnerable, if you think. But what it seems to be is the lack of the gaps in our health system are being filled by our justice system, by the Gardaí. So by the lack of community services, the Gardaí are stepping in. I suppose just to give you a sense that the amount of people of the 1,009, if you think 650 people end up in a centre, detained in a centre, and there's a whole process to vindicate your rights, tribunals, to make sure things are procedurally correct, and that you also have a mental disorder, because deprivation of liberty obviously must be in accordance with law where that happens and limited. So if you think about it, say in 2020, 5,000 our understanding is from the guards about 5,700 times this section 12 was used. And if only 650 of them ended up in the centre, what happened in the other 5,100 cases? And I suppose then you would have to ask the rights in terms of transparency, of vindicating your rights. We don't know what's happening there. So you asked the question, well, what are the checks and balances? We don't know what the checks and balances are. We've met with the Gardaí on a number of occasions. So, for example, if you were brought into a station for drunk driving, you have more rights than a person who has been picked up based on the view of a Gardaí that you have a mental disorder. And you would have to even question the capability of a Gardaí to make that assumption. So it's a questionable area. We've raised with the Gardaí and the Department of Justice, and we think that there should be a process in place to vindicate people's rights. At the very least, that they get the same rights as a drunk driver, that it's time limited to a degree. And then from the point of view of training, we've met with the Gardaí there. And the Gardaí do a lot of their, again, we didn't get a lot of information, we got some information, but it seems to be the Gardaí do a lot of their own internal training, they train their own people. Now this year we've managed to, with the HSE, we're going to do a full day with the Gardaí at a senior level and different people in the health services. But in terms of training the new Gardaí, you would think that would need to come from professionals outside the Gardaí, both legal and mental health. I'll hand over to Susan. Sorry.
Yeah, excuse me. I think it's interesting that, and the point has been made, excuse me, that people with disabilities need to be diverted away from the criminal justice system. And I think we have to go back further than just the Gardaí. I think we have to look at what mental health services are providing. In general, what most mental health services are providing is a out-of-hours service that centres around emergency departments. So the only option for the Gardaí at that stage is to bring them either directly to an approved centre or an inpatient unit, or bring them in through the accident and emergency department. And diversion, there are no arrest stage diversion services in Ireland. There is a pilot supposed to be starting down in Limerick. It hasn't received any funding as far as I'm aware of, and it's a good model based on the Memphis model, which is the original of Garda or police diversion. And if mental health services were available to the Gardaí, so that they could actually assess whether somebody has a mental illness or a mental disorder, whether they need inpatient treatment, whether they need support from other agencies. That's the key, really, to stop people, to stop the guards actually bringing people for admission or for holding them in Garda stations for lengthy periods of time while they try and decide what to do. So I think arrest at the stage of police diversion is really the key to stopping people with disabilities actually getting into the criminal justice system.
And I think just to clarify, in no way am I disparaging the Gardaí. I think they're in, and I don't think any of us are, and I hear, in fact, we're advocating for greater supports for them. They're in a position where they have to make a decision unsupported, but I take your point. I think external training would be of assistance, and then a whole panoply of other options. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will go to Pauline Tully for her questions.
Thank you, and good morning, and thank you all for your presentations this morning. I suppose you have mentioned a couple of themes that we hear regularly as common across all sectors in society, and that is the lack of data on disability in communities, and also the lack of training on disability, and indeed in this case mental health. I know you mentioned here the committee, Irish Prison Penal Reform, you say heard that 1 in 3 people in Irish prisons screen positive for intellectual disability, so it could be greater. And I know you say that we need a system for collection of data, so I'm just wondering, have you envisaged what kind of system or how would that work? Because I'm sure there are many people here with an intellectual disability who also have a mental health illness, and so it's, you know, it's to gather information on those, because how do you solve a problem if you don't know the extent of it? So I'm just wondering on that. The other, the Mental Health Commission, you provide inspections of approved centres. Are all prisons considered approved centres? Or, because we have to realise that a large number of prisoners have mental health issues. That's been said here before. So are all prisons considered approved centres, or are they inspected? Because it was mentioned here as well that a general prison inspection report hasn't been seen since 2014. And I'm just wondering, have all these reports been, have all the reports been gathered but not published? And if that's the case, why? Because that's worrying. I mean, why are these reports not being published? And if we don't know the extent of the problems in the prisons, how can we actually deal with them? And maybe you'd also expand on the higher level task force and diversion, because a number of you mentioned that, and I'm just wondering, you know, you seem to think that this will be a good report and a good it would be something good to happen, but if it's not resourced properly, because you talk about the joint working group of mental health service and the police, and 12 years on that hasn't made any changes, because was it not that it wasn't resourced properly as well? Is that the case, or it wasn't implemented? So I'm talking, we've lots of different reports. If they're not properly resourced and properly implemented, they won't make the difference that they're supposed to. So I suppose it's what advice have you got for us as committee, or indeed for members of government, on how to move these different things forward as well? Because as I said, you could have reports coming out your ear, but unless they're implemented and properly resourced, they're not going to make the difference that they should be making. So thank you.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Who wants to go first?
I'll just address the system of data collection that you spoke about.
Yeah.
IPRT launched Progress in the Penal System 2021, which is our annual report in February. And this year focused on, well, last year even, it focused on transparency in the penal system, so specifically on data and data collection systems. And we propose that basically all the criminal justice system in general should have a system of data collection, of equality monitoring, that is in line with the CSO. And staff and prisoners should be trained, basically staff on one end as to why they're collecting the data and how they can support prisoners in collecting that data, and prisoners in how basically it would benefit them in their everyday life in prison to, I suppose, disclose this type of data to staff in prison. So that's what we've recommended in the Progress in the Penal System report, which we can send over to you guys at a later date. So that, and we've also recommended in the race and ethnicity recently launched report as well in terms of ethnicity data.
Okay.
John?
Well, I can briefly speak to data. Definitely the lack of data across the whole system, the Irish system, is something that we need to increase. But in terms of justice, in fairness to them, they're one of the lead departments that actually is concentrating on trying to put data across the system, but it hasn't been successful to date. I often wonder, like, if you didn't have the information right on your arrest warrant or transfer warrant that's required in law, you know, you'd be released. So why not change the law to include that if there is specific data in relation to disability, that should be on the, and where it's available to the state previously, that should be there. That's one potential way. I'll hand over to Susan in terms of inspection.
Susan?
Yes, yes, you're right. We do inspect approved centres, and we produce a report after our visit, and this is published. We don't have any jurisdiction in the prisons, and that is the function of the Inspector of Prisons, who does do inspections with his team, and produces reports. The decision to publish the reports, I believe, but rests with the Minister of Justice, so I have no further information on that. However, it had come to my attention, and through the previous Inspector of Prisons, about the extent of mental illness in the prisons. And so we, through her assistance and help, we did actually visit the prisons, and I was able to go with her as part of her inspection. I'm able to write the report on circumstances in the criminal justice system for people with mental illness. But we don't, the Mental Health Commission don't have any jurisdiction in the prison. That is the Inspector of Prisons.
Okay. Saoirse.
Yeah, I just want to come in on that as well. It's our understanding that the decision to publish rests with the Minister for Justice. So these inspections have been carried out, and they are routinely carried out by the Inspector of Prisons, but they have not been published. But what we did see were inspection reports, very detailed inspection reports published around COVID-19, so around all the different prisons, and those have been incredibly useful and informative, because we think there should be transparency, that these reports should be published, and that really would lend us a real oversight into what's happening in the prison. We also understand that the legislation to put in place the National Preventative Mechanism to ratify the optional protocol against the Convention Against Torture is imminent, very imminent is my understanding, and that would that would broaden things out to ensure that people who are detained in health facilities as well would also fall within the remit of that new preventative mechanism that would be coordinated by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So I think that is something to look at, and that is something that we have called for quite a lot of time. And obviously also the other thing I would say is the UN Human Rights Committee will be examining Ireland next week in Geneva under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So we have made a submission on that as well, and it deals with some of those issues, so we can send that on to the committee.
Fiona?
Yeah, just a comment there on data collection. There was a report carried out by Claire Edwards and Professor Shane Cook-Commons by the National Disability Authority. It's going back a number of years, but in that there was a recommendation in the findings that there should be data collection at entry point into the criminal justice system. I think perhaps he mentioned a possibility of Pulse collecting some sort of data in relation to that, because the anecdotal evidence has suggested that people have ended up in court, and sometimes it's not until that stage that it becomes apparent that somebody has a disability. So I think An Garda Síochána also have a really important role, that if they can identify, early identification, all the other agencies in the system can be made aware, and maybe, some cases mightn't have to proceed as far as they do.
Okay.
You mentioned the high-level task force. So is it Kathleen Lynch?
Yes.
It's chaired, what it is it's the Gardaí, the prison services, members of the Department of Justice, civil servants in the Department of Justice, civil servants in the Department of Health, and a few other people. And they've a whole area that they're looking at in terms. So we would have raised these areas with them, and the Gardaí, and they're looking at different areas, a task force that they can actually put actions in place. So one of those, for example, was the diversion programme, but that was a year. Must be a year now, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea was they were going to pilot that in Limerick to see if we could run it out in the rest of the country. But again, very often the interaction between different state agencies, who funds it? Is it health? Is it justice? But I must say, it was the first one I got from the Gardaí and the leadership in Limerick. They were really determined to put it in place. And it sounds like a good idea. So that alone happening would set a trend, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a million. Now we'll go to Holly Kearns.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks everyone for being with us today. I think it's been one of the most revealing and frankly unnerving sessions that we've had. The failure of the justice and penal system to recognise and respond to people with disabilities is quite shocking. In some cases, it seems to amount to people being punished because they have an unidentified or unsupported disability, or even an identified one. I think your insights and recommendations are invaluable in helping us prepare reports and hold authorities to account as well. Article 12 of the UNCRPD aims to ensure people with disabilities can make their own decisions, and given that the Assisted Decision Making Amendment Act is being rushed through the Dáil at the moment, I'm going to mainly focus my questions on that. So first, I think mainly for the Mental Health Commission, a significant source of concern reflected in the Children's Committee during pre-legislative scrutiny of the report was the lack of engagement with DPOs, with disabled people's organisations, in developing the Decision Support Service draft codes of practice. There was actually no engagement with DPOs for that. Could you clarify if there's governance arrangements in place to ensure that decision support services are meaningfully engaging with disabled people and the representative organisations in the performance of their functions, especially organisations led by people with intellectual disabilities, experience of mental health services and neurodivergent people and older people. The Assisted Decision Making Amendment Act retains the use of substitute decision making. But the general comment, I think it's number 1 of the UNCRPD, took Article 12 to prohibit substitute decision making. So when Ireland ratified the Convention in 2018, the state entered a declaration permitting the retention of substitute decision making. So I'm just curious to know what the Commission's position on substitute decision making is. And then maybe questions for everybody, and if anybody else wants to come in on that as well, that would be great. But another area of concern is the exclusion of people involuntarily detained from assisted decision making from the bill. So the government's plan to leave changes in this area to the Mental Health Act. I'm just wondering if you'd agree that this is unhelpful and stigmatising to other people with mental health difficulties in realising rights around will and preferences. So should the government address these issues in the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act Amendment Bill now? And finally, the Assisted Decision Making Bill is about recognising and valuing an individual's will and preference. So I'm wondering if you have suggestions or examples, perhaps from other countries, of how this can be achieved in carceral settings, be it imprisonment, or those involuntarily detained, and how do we take their capacity to make decisions seriously?
Okay, will we start with John?
I mean, I've heard that comment before, that there was no engagement with people with disabilities in terms of the decision support service and the guidelines, and that's not correct. So unless there's some technical term that I'm missing, that somehow we haven't engaged, but to even give that impression is just not correct. We've put a lot of work into engaging with stakeholders. We have a forum, we have a stakeholder forum every month where we ensure the voice of the person is heard. I think Anya, and I'm happy to send you the facts of the matter, Anya has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organisations and people non-stop. So the idea that somehow, now it may be that the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, so the Act itself, which we're not accountable for bringing through, that's the department. There may be issues there, but in terms of the DSS, there isn't, because the reason that we want to, and if there is, genuinely, if there's some technical thing that we've missed, that we're not speaking to the right people, I'd want to know, because the reason that we have taken on this decision support is because we want to vindicate the rights of people, you know, with a disability, and we want to vindicate people's human rights. So there may be some confusion in what one group is saying or informing you and what we're doing, and I'm happy to discuss that, but quite genuinely, we have put the engagement at the centre of it. So, I mean, just to be...
Which DPOs have you engaged with then? Excuse me if I'm incorrect.
But sure, I mean, I can get on you to send it on to you exactly, I mean, but I mean, we've engaged with hundreds of organisations and thousands of people with disabilities. Like, so, I don't know, like maybe you could tell us the ones we haven't engaged with, and I'll send that on to Anya, and we'll absolutely rectify it.
Yeah, any of the ones that have come before this committee have said they weren't engaged with on the draft codes of practice. So one of the biggest concerns with the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act bill, codes of practice, was that,
but should we put the codes of practice out from, the codes of practice were out for public consultation from, I think, November to February. 3 or 4 months, and so I mean I'm very happy to, like if you have factual evidence that that's the case, please give it to me, and I will absolutely make sure that those people are included. But we've seen hundreds and hundreds of groups and thousands of people, and we've had our engagement got more an above average response, like a significant response, and we do want to hear from people. Like, I mean, why would we not want to hear from people? The whole point of the Act is to help these people.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, one of the main concerns, I suppose, is those draft codes of practice make a provision for example, a bank teller to refuse somebody their money in a bank. So that goes it flies in the face of the whole purpose of the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, and they were the concerns that we heard at the committee from DPOs who said they weren't engaged with. And I mean, that would be assuming incapacity rather than assuming capacity. So the codes of practice from the DPOs we engaged with were extremely put out by that, understandably, and I think so was the committee.
Well, I could understand why people would be put out by that if that's what people perceived, and it's something that we would definitely like to fix if we can get evidence that would actually is what is occurring or would occur. I suppose just to give you a sense, there's an assumed capacity in the Act, and one of the powers that we have in the Act is that to monitor and enforce and regulate that people are using the Act in good faith. Because I did hear that, and I actually read it in the paper, and the idea that someone would go to a bank and a bank person would somehow say, sorry, I don't believe your capacity, so you're not getting an account. I was part of HICOR where we went into the centres for people with disability, and none of them had accounts, and the staff were running the accounts and using the money, and we heard similar things like that from the staff, and yet actually when we pushed it, thousands of individuals were given bank accounts, and this is before the Act. So I do think that, quite genuinely, the Act may have some flaws, interpretive and analytical flaws and academic, perceptual flaws, but most Acts do. But I mean, I'm more than welcome to address that question to the Director and give you a formal reply on it. But I would be very surprised if someone went to a bank and that happened with the powers we would have. If they came to us, we would absolutely go after that area to make sure that they were using the law properly. And the other thing is working with the banks, and I know the banks get have received a lot of flack, but they've actually engaged with this in terms of training and bringing people up to standards in terms of the Act. So it's unfortunate. I wouldn't like that to be the case, and hopefully we can get a meeting with the people who think that may be the case. But genuinely, through all our consultation and talking to thousands of people, that never really came up until that till you mentioned it. And I have to say, I'm surprised that you're surprised that people are refused money at a bank. This is a regular occurrence for older people, for people with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities. That's not unheard of at all. It's surprising for me that you're surprised to hear that. That's the whole purpose. That's why we need this legislation. You say it's a regular occurrence. Where's your evidence for that? Even people coming into people I know. Well, it does happen. Absolutely does. We've heard that as a committee. People being treated differently because they have a disability is a reality. And to say that there was loads of time, loads of engagement, like even the department were upfront and honest with us as a committee about the fact that they had to rush through the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act because there's a case been taken against the state. So if there wasn't adequate engagement, that's not true. We all know that. And they've asked for... Can I just clarify? You said about the codes, not the Act. I clarified to you earlier the Act was something for the department. I'm not standing over the department. I'm saying in relation to the codes. You said specifically that you're given the impression that we've excluded people with disabilities, which we haven't. We've put all efforts in place to do that. So I just wanted, I'm just giving you our view. We're not the department. We're not the Act. We're the Mental Health Commission. We had the codes to do, and the Director had the codes to do. So I'm just giving you the alternative view from our perspective. So, and I'm happy to give you I'm right to the committee with the facts, the amount of people with disabilities and organisations we engage with.
Yeah, we'd appreciate that.
And to review the code's practice,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, Saoirse.
Just on the decision support service, I suppose the only thing I would say is that we really need to think about the practicalities and the logistics of people in prison being able to access that once it's brought in, because obviously, you know, we've talked a lot about resourcing the Gardaí and how they're under-resourced. I would say the same for the Irish Prison Service. You know, prison officers are not trained in how to deal with mental health issues in the way that sometimes they need to be. And it is an unfair pressure that is put on them. So I think that is something we need to really think about. You know, the report that we mentioned earlier talks about, you know, the under-resourcing of interpretation for people who may be deaf, or people being isolated in their cells because the physical conditions in prison just they can't cope with their disability. And, you know, when there's overcrowding as well, that's an issue. So people should be in single cell occupancy as well. But I suppose on your other point, Deputy Cairns, just on the exclusion of people involuntarily detained, we, along with our colleagues in mental health reform, would have written to the Taoiseach on this very recently. We think that this should be addressed now. It will need to be addressed at some point. So why kick it down the road? We think that that there is a huge issue there for the exclusion of people who are involuntarily detained, particularly around things like advanced healthcare directives. So we would hope that that would be addressed before the Act is finalised, even if it is being pushed through at a very fast pace.
Okay. Fiona?
The only comment we have to make is in terms of the work that we've done. We've engaged a lot with not just disability organisations, but also self-advocacy groups. But unfortunately, because we haven't been able to roll out what we're trying to do, we don't think it's fair to take up their time without having the resources to help them as well.
Okay.
So I think that's where we're at, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, thank you. Now, Eileen is not able to attend in person this morning, and she just asked me to raise a few questions on her behalf. So she works with the Autism Committee as well. She works the newly formed Autism Committee, and she's been speaking to autistic people about their experiences. And one of the things she's learned is that some sensory inputs others might not notice can actually be physically painful for autistic people. In fact, many autistic people describe them like torture. And in accessibility reviews of the prisons and other places of detention, how have they assessed for sensory accessibility? What screening procedures are in place within the justice system for neurodiversity, intellectual disability, and people with other impairments who are vastly overrepresented in prisons and face prejudice as witnesses or defendants at trials? You've all talked, I suppose, today about the lack of information on disability and the huge barrier to make sure disability people have equal access to justice. What can we do immediately to improve the data collection and sharing between agencies involved in the justice system on disabilities? Why can't the Garda Public Attitude Survey and the quarterly National Household Survey start collecting and sharing usable information on disabilities from immediately? And could any witness explain on the areas where they have revised the Assisted Making Decisions Act, where the revised Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act falls short of the standards set in the CRPD when it comes to disability people's equal access to justice? For example, in not going far enough in making sure disabled persons are accommodated on juries, and still on using substituted decision making instead of upholding all disability people's rights to support the decision making. So there are Eileen's comments. So maybe some, if you could reflect on and take on that. Who wants to go first?
Can I give you a written answer on the substitute one, because it's come up. It's obviously a substantive matter. It's been raised a couple of times.
Yes.
And I will make sure that the director gives the rationale, our opinion in the MHC and the DSS on it.
Okay. We'd appreciate that. Saoirse.
Yeah, just on the autism piece, I'm sure, and if you haven't already listened to Senator Lynn Rowan's podcast that she has done around Voices in Prison, and one of the things that they talk about within it is a project that was being started by As I Am, the autism charity, and that was actually put on hold, I think, due to COVID. But that was a huge issue, for people with autism, many of whom might be undiagnosed within the penal system. That is something that, As I Am are the experts in the area. So we would hope that project that they have in the prison system would be up and running again. I suppose one of the things that was identified in the Making Rights Real for People with Disabilities in Prison report was people with sensory issues who may have neurodivergent conditions. If they have to share a cell, that can be very overwhelming for them. The noises from other people, the lack of personal space, that is something that is, that can cause them quite a bit of trauma. So it is something that we would have recommended that, and I would have mentioned before, around single cell occupancy. The numbers in prison at the moment are the highest that they've been in a very long time. We saw during COVID the numbers reduced dramatically, for various reasons. But we have over 4,000 people within the prison system. I think is it a 7% increase on the same week last year. So that is of concern. The numbers were starting to go in the right direction. We were starting to see people, serving more community service orders, other, diversion mechanisms put in place. So the more people that are in prison, the more we have to think about those with disabilities and how we are accommodating those and addressing any of the issues that they might have. And then I suppose in the sharing of data between different agencies, I suppose GDPR is the thing that I imagine a lot of the agencies would say. So I suppose they would have to look at maybe when they are collecting the data, looking at protocols being put in place and whether or not they are getting consent from people to share their information with other agencies. I don't see how you would do it without that. But, that is something that perhaps could be explored by some of those agencies. Sarahjane, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Covers everything.
Okay, thanks.
And Fiona?
Yes, thank you. Just in relation to people with autism and sensory issues, there's lots of other people who present with disabilities who would have sensory issues as well. And I think the environment needs to be explored, whether it's a Garda station or a prison or a courtroom. It has to be looked at holistically. If the environment is right and they're supported properly, that's the most beneficial support you can give to somebody with a disability. But certainly the environment, which the criminal courts of justice, would be laid out properly. But there's a lot of other courtrooms around the country and a lot of other Garda stations that the environment wouldn't be conducive for people with this disability, and a lot of investment would need to be put into that, I think.
Yeah. Right, thank you very much for your contributions this morning, and I suppose for the challenge, within mental health and within the prison services for people with disabilities. I suppose every Thursday morning we meet with witnesses who empower us with the challenges that are facing people with disabilities, which are right across society. And this morning is on the justice system and on the prison system and mental health. And as you were answering the questions and as you were making the opening contributions, we have a long ways to go as a society to make sure that we are completely and absolutely inclusive. The world over, not just Ireland, but the world over. But I was struck by the responses there on the autism, on Eileen's first question on autism and making the, having regard for people with autistic people within the prison services, within the Garda stations, and we really have an awful lot of work to do on it. But I thank you for the evidence. I thank the members of the committee for their evidence this morning. And if there are other issues that we have addressed, and I know, John, you have committed to giving us some further information, I would greatly appreciate that. And if there's any other information that you think, Fiona?
We'd be happy to share the park technique, the information around that, to members of the committee if they'd like to have a look at.
We would very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
We very much appreciate it. And if there's anything, you know, that you think of following today's meeting, that the more information we have, the better we are at trying to do the job that we are trying to do to make it better for people with disabilities right across the spectrum, you know, right across society, and improve their living conditions, I suppose, wherever they are. So I thank you one and all for coming before us and being so honest with us, and any information you can forward to us, we'd greatly appreciate. To our members this morning, thank you. Sorry, Mary.
I think I would be anxious to follow up that our committee has a voice and an input on the rights of people with disabilities in the prison services and how we can advance and support the review that's going on. I think we have a valuable contribution as a committee on that. That would be a very significant voice. So if I could propose that, I appreciate we may want to speak about it in private, but I think following on, there's a very clear, and I know the heart of this committee would be very much to speak out and support.
Okay, certainly.
Just make one point.
Yes.
I mean, there's great goodwill around the table. I'm not as an expert in the areas that we're discussing this morning, but one thing I've noticed is the lack of coordination and bringing together. The Brady report way back spoke about everything operating in silos, and that is having listened to quite a number of bodies, all doing great work, guards, prison officers, so on. But the one thing that's lacking seems to be some drawing together of the strands that are there, and that should, inform us all as we're going along. And I think would make our job, your job. I mean, our area here, we're talking about just training, awareness training, getting people on side, and that would be the way we would. It's a point I'd like to emphasise, and we probably will emphasise in anything we send back to you. But we appreciate very much the opportunity this morning as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and Jerry, that point is extremely well made, right? And we see it at our committee here, the evidence that is given to us. And, we looked into where do we go for, and is it health, is it education, is it disabilities, is it, what are the agencies that we need? And, an overarching, body that, first of all, has power to implement it, but is actually capable of bringing the strands together. Yes, that point is well made. So I thank you one and all for it. We will revert back to that, Mary, and certainly something to look at. To our team, of course, for keeping us all straight and narrow and making sure that everything is done properly. We appreciate it. And to the members, so our meeting stands adjourned until this morning week at 9 o'clock. Okay, thank you.